everyone, are you ready for our 5th video from Marcus Kids Days this summer? In case you don't know already, I'm McKenna from Artists Working in Education, and I'm excited to introduce a few new art projects to you today. Each week I've been starting out our videos by listing the elements of art that we've already talked about. So, do you remember what those are? If you remember any of them, feel free to shout them out, and I'm also going to list the 4 elements we've looked at so far. So week 1 was line, week 2 was shape, 3 was color, 4 was form, and then our 5th element of art is going to be texture. So we'll look at different projects that involve texture today. First, I'll challenge you to brainstorm a time where you've heard the word texture. If you've never heard it before, that's okay. This might be a new word for some of you out there. I'm asking if you've heard the word texture before because we do use it to describe a lot of different things. I've personally heard the word texture before when people are talking about food. Someone might taste chocolate and say, "Oh, this has a really smooth texture." Another time people say texture is with food too when people are baking. So some people might say when you're mixing your pancake batter, make sure it has a consistent texture or a liquidy texture. I've also heard texture used when people are talking about clothes. Maybe you put on a sweater and you say, "Ooh, this sweater has a pretty itchy texture." Or, "My t-shirt has a soft texture." Texture is the word we use to describe surfaces, which are like the outside of things. You might say, "This is the surface of the table here." Texture can be seen and felt, so you can do both. Imagine that you see someone walking across the street from you with a really fluffy dog. From afar, you might look at the dog and say, "Ooh, it looks really fluffy. I bet if I touch it, it's going to be soft." So first you're seeing the texture, but if you actually do approach a dog and you pet it, you can confirm, yeah, it's soft and fluffy. The way that textures look and feel aren't always the same though. For example, in art, I could make a drawing of a hedgehog, and hedgehogs are really spiky animals, so I was going to try to make it like really spiky. But when you touch the paper, it's just going to feel flat and smooth like paper does. When we are making art, maybe we are making 3D art that's a sculpture, and that art will have the same texture that is seen and felt. But when we're making drawings, we have to use different tools to create the textures that we want. Sometimes artists make drawings that look so realistic, like they're popping off the page. That's a way that we can use texture to make our art look very realistic. We're going to start with an activity that I like to do when I was a kid. It's a fun activity called leaf rubbing. So last week at the end of the video I said that you might need some things from nature for this project. And what we're going to do is we're going to go outside and pick out a few different leaves or maybe flowers or sticks that are outdoors, and we're going to bring them inside and use them for our first project. If you are going to go outdoors and grab some leaves, make sure that you ask a grown-up for permission and see if maybe a grown-up or an older sibling wants to go outside with you. So I'm going to look for some leaves, and I'm going to try to find leaves that have already fallen on the ground instead of ripping them off the plants. So here's a good leaf. This one is pretty big too. This is an example of a bigger leaf that you might find, and you can also look for different sizes. Here's a few different ones that I can use. When you're back inside, make sure you have some white paper, and I'm going to use oil pastels. I think pastels or crayons are going to work the best. I'll show you what oil pastels look like. So sometimes they do just look like little rectangles, but these pastels kind of look like crayons where they have a pointy tip. I grabbed a few crayons too, so you can use crayons for this project as well. These are what oil pastels versus crayons look like. Start by looking closely at the different leaves you found. Think about what their different shapes look like. Maybe notice if they're dry or they're more lively, they still have water in them. Maybe they're parts or maybe they're whole leaves. How would you describe the texture you feel when you hold the leaves? Are a lot of them different, or are they the same texture? Does the texture on the leaves feel the same way that it looks, or is it different? With this leaf, I can see a lot of little ridges, so I think it's going to be kind of bumpy, and it is when I touch it. So the texture is pretty similar. So next you're going to want to use a flat surface like this table and lay down just one of your leaves. I'm going to start with this big leaf. I think that this one has a good shape. Then you're going to place your paper on top of it. So you won't be able to see it anymore, but you can still feel it. When we're doing this, another way to think about texture is to touch your paper and see how that feels. Depending on what paper you're using, it's probably smooth and soft. Next, pick a color with your crayons or your oil pastels and color on top of where the leaf is on your paper. And you're going to see what happens. You can watch as I'm doing it, and you can also follow along with your leaf. So I'm going to feel that the leaf is pretty much in the middle. So next, pick one of your crayons or your pastels, and you're going to draw over where the leaf is on the paper and see what happens. I have to press down, I'd say like medium to hard pressure. Can you see what's showing up on there? I'm starting to see some of the lines or the veins on the leaf. Wow, that's pretty cool. So even if you kind of lose track where your leaf is in relation to your paper, you can uncover where it is as you draw. I can see the edges here. Now I can see the whole leaf, starting with the stem, and I can trace around it to kind of show you where it starts and where it ends. When you finish your first drawing, what you can do is you can move your leaf and do it again and do an overlap. You can switch leaves. It's basically an experiment to see what looks really cool when you put it on the paper. So I shifted my leaf. Now it's here. This is where you have the choice. You can either overlap them or you can leave it how it is. So I'm going to overlap them, so I'm putting my purple marks over the blue. I'm also going to try it with crayons instead of oil pastels and see what happens. So you can see it shows up with crayons too. So you can experiment with different materials. I'm going to try tracing one of my other leaves. See what happens with this one. This one is a little bit harder to see. So you can tell that different leaves work in different ways. Some of them might look better than others on the paper. Another fun thing you can do is switch colors when you're tracing the same leaf. So this project has helped us transfer the texture of the leaves right onto our paper. Usually when we make art, we have to think of different ways to make marks on the paper to kind of show the texture that we're trying to get across. But with this project, we're really just using the leaf to get that texture right onto the paper. You can keep experimenting with different colors and using different leaves. See what happens when you do different colors on one sheet of paper or overlap leaves on the same paper. Another fun thing you can do is use scissors and cut out the shape of the leaf after you've traced it. So that's another option if you want to keep going with this project. So before we move on, we're going to take a look at an artist who shows a lot of texture in his paintings. That artist is David Hockney from England, and he still makes art today. He paints landscapes and portraits that use bright and bold colors. Look at this landscape painting and count how many different textures you can see. I see some water that looks very wavy yet smooth, fields that look flat, and plants that look pointy. He did a series of paintings called Dog Days where he painted his 2 dogs. I like this painting because we can see that the dog's fur has different texture than the dog bed it's sleeping on. You can see how many different textures you can count in this painting too. We created texture with our leaf rubbing, so we can also make texture without any tracing involved. We are going to think of a few textures that we can make in our drawings. You're going to need another piece of paper, and you can also use crayons, pastels, or colored pencils for the next project. Once you have your supplies ready, we're going to brainstorm a few different objects and think about what textures they are. Then we're going to draw them together on our paper. As artists, we have to get a little creative when we add textures to our drawings and paintings. The main thing to keep in mind is to think about how something feels in real life, and then think of what different patterns you can use to show the texture it is. We'll start out with one that's a little easy. So think about the texture of a sheep's wool. Even if you've never felt a sheep, maybe you've seen a sheep and you can see that they have really curly, fluffy wool. Because they have that kind of wool, I would create a texture by making lots of curls next to each other. So you can follow along if you want to try to make the curls too. I'm just doing this by making a lot of little curls or loop-de-loops with my crayon. I think it's starting to look like a sheep's body. Maybe I'll see by drawing a head on it to see if it actually looks like a sheep. Yep. So that's a way that you could draw something that's curly. I'll draw a big version so you can see a little better. So just a series of loop-de-loops, curves, or swirls. How about the texture of sand? If I wanted to draw the beach, there would be sand. So thinking about how sand feels and looks, I know that it's made up out of a lot of very small pieces. So I think that I would draw tiny dots to show sand. Draw very tiny dots next to each other and very close together. It's almost just like pressing your pencil or your crayon into the paper repeatedly to make these little dots. Next, let's think about how you would draw hair to show the different texture of hair. Everyone's hair has a different texture. So one of the ways you could draw hair is by making wavy hair. If you were doing a self-portrait, think about the way that you would draw your hair. To make wavy, I'm doing a lot of squiggles that are right next to each other. Or maybe your hair isn't wavy and it's really curly. You could have tight curls, which is kind of like the first drawing I did, where there's a lot of squiggles, but I'm making them even closer together. You could also have loose curls. So these squiggles might be a little bit rounder, they might be bigger. And some people have straight hair. So straight hair would just be a lot of straight or maybe slightly curved lines next to each other. There's a lot of different ways we can make hair. And some people don't even have any hair at all, so if you're going to draw someone without hair, you would just leave smooth texture for their head. If you can think of more objects you want to draw textures for, just go for it. It's fun to get more practice with drawing. We're going to take an up-close look at a few different textures that I found around this office. You can take a look and do a little texture scavenger hunt in your home too, or you can simply observe the different clothes you're wearing and see what textures they have. But first, let's take a look at this bubble wrap. So I can touch it because I'm here, but you're just going to have to rely on your sight to see the texture. For me, this is really bumpy, really wavy, and it's also smooth because it's made out of plastic. Here's another texture that's on a pillow. This pillow is soft. You can see that there's a bunch of different threads that are woven together, and they're woven so tightly that it's very soft. There aren't a lot of bumps on this. Another thing we can look at is the texture of a candy wrapper. So this is made out of plastic, so it is smooth, but it's bumpy too. You can also find different textures in different craft supplies. So this is like a wavy, like ribbed kind of paper. You can see the edge there. So this is a cool one to feel the texture of. It's very bumpy, and it's almost like an instrument. For our final project, we're going to do a type of collage. Have you ever done a collage before? Or have you heard the word collage? A collage is a type of art that takes lots of little pieces from other material and it puts it together to make something new. For example, artists will look in magazines or newspaper for pictures, then they'll cut and they'll paste them onto a new piece of paper, and that's what a collage is. If it sounds a little confusing now, we're going to walk through it as we make our project. We're going to make something called a texture collage. What we're going to do is use animals as our subject, and we're going to think about the different textures that we see on our favorite animal, or maybe an animal you have in your house. You could do your pet. I'm going to make a dog, and the first thing I'm going to do is think of the few different textures I see when I look at a dog. We're using pretty much the same materials we have been for the other two projects, but you're welcome to use markers, crayons, colored pencils, pastels. You'll also need a few different sheets of paper. You can use regular white paper or construction paper, and you'll want to have some glue and some scissors. I'm going to use a glue stick because we only need to glue paper together, and glue sticks work pretty well for that. So I have this paper I'm going to use as my base, and then I have different colors of construction paper. But depending on the animal you want to make, you're going to have to choose the colors that make the most sense, or if you want to do sort of like a fantasy animal, you can make it whatever color you'd like. If I wanted to make a purple dog, I could do that. But I think I'm going to stick with a brown and yellow and orange dog. So when I say texture collage, the idea that I have in mind is to focus on filling this page with the texture that I think a dog's body or its fur would be. That's going to be the first step, so think of the kind of texture that most of your animal is. I'll think of a few more examples that might help you out. So for a dog, I'm going to do fur. That would be the same for a cat, or a cow, or a horse. They would have this short hair. If you wanted to do something like a frog, all you'd have to do is really make it one color. It would be like a shiny animal. If you wanted to do a snake or a lizard, you would draw little scales. Maybe they'd look bumpy. If you wanted to do a fish, you could do different scales on that too. So think about the texture that the full body or the main parts of the animal would be. So thinking about a dog's fur, it would be made out of lots of short hairs, so I would draw lines or zigzags. I'm just going to cover a big piece of my paper with this design, and then after that I'm going to cut it out in the shape that I want. Now my first texture sheet is all filled up, so I think that I have enough here where I can cut out the shape of the dog that I want. This is my background, so the first thing I'm going to do is cut out the shapes I need and glue them onto this paper. If it's helpful, you can also draw out the shapes that you want. So I'm going to do a dog's body, and also a dog's head. I think it looks about like that. So I'm going to start by cutting out these two shapes. You might notice right away that something is missing. Do you know what it is? The ears are missing. And I didn't make the ears yet because I want the ears to be a different kind of texture than the head and then the body. I think dogs' ears, at least dogs that I've seen, the hair on their ears is a little bit shorter than the hair on the rest of their body. So I'm going to draw that next. And instead of filling up this whole sheet, I'm just going to fill up the space that I think that I'll need. If you're drawing close to the edge like this, you can also put some paper below it so you don't draw on your table. I think this is enough space for my ear drawings, so I'm going to draw the outline, and if I do need to draw more texture on the paper, I can do that. Okay, those are my two ears, so I'm going to cut them out. Okay, now I have the textures for the head, the body, and the two ears. Can you see the difference between the lines I used for this and this? It's a very similar line, but they're both a little bit different in size. So I did the lines on the ears smaller because the hair on dogs' ears is shorter. Next, I'm going to do the texture of the nose. Most dogs have either a black or a brown nose. I'm going to use black, and then I'm going to use a black crayon on top of it. If you look really closely at a dog's nose, it almost looks like it's a series of a bunch of little circles. So that's why I'm doing these squiggly lines. Kind of like when I drew textures and I drew the sheep's wool. This time I'm using that same technique for the dog's nose. I know the nose isn't going to take up that much space, so I only drew this much. Now I'm going to draw the outline of what I need. I know the dog's noses are kind of like upside down triangles, but they're really round. Now looking at it, what's the obvious thing that's missing? The eyes. So I'm going to cut out two eyes to put on it, and eyes don't have a lot of texture. But our irises, which is the colored part of our eyes, that has a little bit of texture, so I can draw that. Okay, now I added some eyes too, because dogs gotta have eyes. And last thing I want to do for now, I think, is add a tongue. And tongues have a texture that isn't too different than the nose. But I'm going to use pink, and I'm going to make the little circles even smaller than I did for the nose. If you've ever looked at your own tongue or another mammal's tongue, we have taste buds that are kind of visible, so we have these little bumps on our tongues. It's especially apparent too with animals, like if a cat has ever licked you, they have these really rough tongues. And dogs are different, but they still have those taste buds, so their tongues aren't totally flat. Okay, I think that's enough coloring that I need for my tongue. Cool, so now if I want to, I can glue down all the different parts. You can also add things to the background, so I'm going to show you how to do that next. Cool, so now I've got my dog with its several different textures. Long fur, short fur, bumpy tongue, and bumpy nose. I think I'm going to add a little bit of grass, because dogs like to play outside. So you can have fun experimenting with adding things to the background, or you can layer things on top of your animal too. Okay, then I added some grass to the front and I drew those spiky lines to make the grass. You can also add things to the background if you want. I think I'm going to color in the background blue. And if this is the sky, I know that the texture is pretty flat looking. We don't really know what the sky feels like, but we know that clouds are big and poofy, and if we draw clouds, we can draw them like that. One way to draw something that doesn't have a lot of texture is to draw lightly with your crayon or draw on the side of it so you cover more space at once. If you don't want something that shows up a lot of visible lines, you can do it this way. For a bonus project, you can make paper dolls. Clothing is another thing in our lives that has lots of different textures to observe. You can make a paper doll and show the different textures on different pieces of clothing. First, make the shape of your doll. You can think about the shape of a gingerbread person or trace a doll you might have. Then, trace your doll to make sure the items of clothing you make fit. Draw pants, shirts, a dress, a skirt, a hat, or shoes, whatever you like. Make sure you add little square tabs to the sides of the clothes you draw, like in the picture. These tabs can be bent and then they attach to your doll, just like a real paper doll is made.